March 12, 1989. Early morning sunlight filtered through the smog of a distant training ground somewhere in Western Europe. The cold bit sharply at the exposed faces of Soviet-trained generals standing atop a shallow ridge, binoculars pressed tightly against their eyes. Below, a line of T-72 tanks rumbled forward in perfect formation, their engines growling like caged beasts. The commanders, hardened veterans of decades studying armored warfare, expected dominance, steel leviathans built to crush any opposition. Yet, what unfolded in the next few minutes would shatter that expectation. Across the field, a dozen U.S. armored units advanced with clinical precision, their M1 Abrams tanks glinting in the morning haze. The Americans moved with a confidence born from years of technological investment and tactical doctrine that the Soviet generals had studied but never truly experienced in action. The first T-72 was hit before it could even reach the halfway point. A thunderous explosion shook the ground, sending shards of armor into the crisp air. Smoke and fire erupted in a deadly plume, marking the first of what would become a series of devastating strikes. The generals' faces went pale, their rigid stances faltering as they realized these weren't isolated hits, this was a systematic annihilation. General Ivan Petrov, a grizzled veteran with decades in the armored divisions, muttered under his breath, "How is this possible? They're all gone before our volleys even land." Around him, aides scrambled to note the unfolding disaster, their pens trembling as much from shock as from the bitter wind. Each T-72 that fell seemed to defy logic, its supposedly indomitable armor no match for the precise targeting, advanced ammunition, and superior fire control of the U.S. forces. The sound of shellfire and the whistle of incoming projectiles filled the valley. For the first time in his career, Colonel Sergei Mikhailov, a tactician renowned for his unflappable composure, felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. Every armored vehicle that erupted into flame was a lesson delivered with ruthless clarity. The era of brute force in tank warfare was over. The battlefield was no longer dominated solely by the weight of steel, it was dominated by speed, information, and technological superiority. As CNN cameras captured the scene, broadcasting it across the globe, the generals watched in stunned silence. This wasn't a textbook battle. There were no staged maneuvers, no rehearsed drills. Every second revealed a new vulnerability, a flaw in the T-72 design they had once relied on as the backbone of their armored might. The images, flickering across the television screens, would become a point of disbelief for armored forces worldwide. The Soviet giants, so feared and respected, were helpless under the precision and coordination of modern U.S. armor. In that moment, the air was thick with acrid smoke, the scent of burning fuel and scorched metal mingling with the cold breeze. The generals' eyes traced the destruction, their minds racing through every possible explanation, training errors, miscalculations, perhaps even luck. But deep down, they understood the truth: their tanks, formidable though they had been, were no match for the new face of warfare. March 12, 1989. The smoke from the destroyed T-72s still hung in the pale morning sky as the generals retreated a few meters behind the ridge, trying to regain composure. General Petrov's hands, normally steady on his binoculars, shook slightly as he scribbled frantic notes. His assistant, Lieutenant Colonel Dmitry Volkov, whispered under his breath, "Sir, they've neutralized nearly half the battalion before our counterattack even began." The Americans didn't slow. The M1 Abrams tanks moved methodically, tracking each Soviet vehicle with sensors and targeting systems that made the T-72 crew's efforts almost futile. Dust and debris flew in every direction, punctuated by the sharp, metallic thwack of armor being pierced. Petrov's mind raced, recalling endless war games, simulations, and tactical briefings. None had predicted this speed of annihilation. Colonel Mikhailov's jaw clenched as he barked orders to the remaining units, attempting a countermaneuver. "Flank left. Fire on my mark." But the T-72s, slower to respond and hampered by outdated optics, were already falling into the range of U.S. tank gunners. A single well-aimed shell could incapacitate an entire turret, and within seconds, it did. Nearby, a younger general, Captain Alexei Kuznetsov, had tears forming at the corner of his eyes, not from physical danger, but from the stark realization of obsolescence. "We trained for perfection," he muttered, voice barely audible over the thunder of explosions. "We studied every tactic, every weakness, and yet, here we are." CNN reporters, embedded safely behind armored vehicles, described the scene with an almost clinical detachment. The T-72s, once considered the pinnacle of Soviet armored design, are being decimated. U.S. forces demonstrate superior targeting, speed, and coordination that leaves observers in disbelief. The generals could hear the commentary echoing in the background, a second confirmation of their humiliation and the growing reality that their technological edge had been eclipsed. As the engagement continued, the battlefield became a chaotic tableau of twisted metal and smoke. The surviving T-72s retreated, leaving the scorched earth behind, while U.S. forces secured the area without pause. Petrov, finally lowering his binoculars, exhaled slowly. For the first time in decades of service, he questioned the entire foundation of armored warfare as he had known it. In the distance, the shattered remains of the T-72s glinted in the early sunlight, a sobering reminder of vulnerability, of how quickly power could evaporate in the face of precision and technology. The generals knew history would remember this moment, not as a minor skirmish, but as a turning point, the day the unstoppable Soviet tanks met an opponent they could not outmatch. The ridge offered some cover, but the psychological impact of the battle was far from over. Soviet generals huddled in small groups, their breaths misting in the cold morning air as they tried to process what they had witnessed. The smoke, acrid and heavy, clawed at their throats, mixing with the metallic scent of shattered armor. Each destroyed T-72 wasn't just a vehicle, it was a symbol of decades of doctrine, pride, and the painstaking training that had defined their careers. General Petrov's voice, usually booming and resolute, was low and tight. "We underestimated them," he admitted, almost to himself. "Every assumption we made, wrong. Every calculation, outdated." Lieutenant Colonel Volkov nodded grimly, eyes scanning the terrain as if searching for some overlooked detail, some trick that could explain the systematic destruction. But there was none. The Americans had anticipated every move, adapted in real time, and executed with cold, lethal efficiency. In the makeshift command post, aides attempted to track survivors. Crew members who had abandoned their tanks crouched behind debris, dazed and shaking, their faces streaked with soot and fear. A young lieutenant, barely 22, whispered to himself, "How are they doing this? Our tanks are supposed to be invincible." The words hung in the air, heavy with disbelief. The general's shock was mirrored by frustration. Petrov slammed a fist against the steel railing of the observation post, the sound echoing like a punctuation mark over the distant echoes of cannon fire. "This is not war as we knew it," he shouted. "It's precision. It's a different game entirely." Around him, the younger officers absorbed the gravity of the statement, the weight of obsolescence pressing down like the winter sky overhead. CNN's cameras continued to roll, capturing not just the destruction, but the human reaction. Faces pale, eyes wide, the generals were broadcast worldwide, Soviet-trained strategists stunned by their own helplessness. It was a visual that would define the engagement, the old guard confronted with the brutal efficiency of modern warfare, their pride crumpled alongside their tanks. As the dust settled, the battlefield revealed a surreal stillness. Smoke spiraled lazily from the wreckage, punctuated by occasional bursts of flame from delayed ignition. The T-72s, once fearsome instruments of war, lay twisted and broken. U.S. crews moved among the wreckage, methodically securing their positions, while Soviet generals retreated to regroup, their minds racing for explanations, for solutions, yet knowing deep down that the rules of engagement had changed irrevocably. By midday, the acrid smoke had begun to thin, revealing the full scale of devastation. The T-72s, once lined up like an armored wall of invincibility, were now a scattered graveyard of charred steel. General Petrov walked among the wreckage, boots crunching on splintered armor plates. Each step was a reminder of years spent mastering tactics that now seemed archaic, powerless against the precision and technology of the U.S. forces. The American crews worked with methodical calm, repairing minor damage, reloading ammunition, and coordinating their positions for potential counterattacks. Each move was deliberate, measured, and devastatingly effective, a demonstration of training and technological superiority that the Soviet generals could only watch in awe and disbelief. Colonel Mikhailov finally addressed the group, voice heavy with resignation. "We have to accept this," he said, eyes scanning the battlefield. "This is not a failure of courage or discipline. It is a lesson in evolution. Technology, tactics, speed, they have rewritten the rules." His words hung in the frosty air, carrying both humility and a painful clarity. Petrov's gaze fell on a T-72 turret, split down the middle, its gun barrel twisted like a broken tooth. He recalled the countless war games, the theoretical battles they had rehearsed, each scenario predicting dominance, but this, the reality, was nothing like any calculation. He muttered to himself, "We studied them, we knew their weaknesses, but we could never anticipate their execution." The generals convened in a temporary command tent, maps spread across tables, notes scattered. Discussion shifted from shock to analysis, from disbelief to determination. Every commander present recognized that the era of brute force armor supremacy was over. The battlefield had changed, and so must their strategies. Even as humiliation lingered, a new understanding began to take root: adaptation was not optional, it was essential for survival. Outside the tent, the wind carried the scent of smoke and scorched metal, mixing with the distant hum of operational tanks. CNN reporters captured the scene, interviewing American commanders who spoke with restrained professionalism about precision, coordination, and technological innovation. The footage of stunned Soviet generals would travel the globe, an unvarnished portrait of military shock and a testament to how rapidly warfare could evolve in the modern age. As night approached, the battlefield lay quiet but for the occasional hiss of cooling engines and the crackle of small fires. The generals, physically unscathed but mentally shaken, understood that history had delivered a brutal lesson. Their T-72s had been more than machines, they were symbols of power, of decades of military doctrine, but even symbols could crumble under the weight of progress. Night had fallen over the battlefield, leaving only the faint glow of fires from destroyed T-72s. The smoke had begun to drift away, revealing the jagged silhouette of twisted steel against the darkening sky. The generals remained on the ridge, huddled beneath heavy coats, their breath steaming in the cold air. Silence hung between them, broken only by distant hums of engines and the occasional pop of residual fires. General Petrov leaned on his binoculars, staring at the once proud battalion now reduced to smoldering wreckage. His mind replayed the morning in agonizing detail: the coordinated strikes, the precision shelling, the speed at which each armored vehicle fell. "We fought hard, we trained hard, yet it was never enough," he murmured. Around him, the younger officers avoided eye contact, each lost in private reckoning with the lesson before them. The ridge offered a vantage point not just over the battlefield but over the future of armored warfare itself. Colonel Mikhailov spoke softly, almost to himself: "Technology has become the arbiter of victory. Tactics, courage, numbers, they matter, yes, but without adaptation, none of it holds." His words, though quiet, carried the weight of a grim realization that would echo through every armored division under his command. CNN footage continued to broadcast worldwide, capturing the stunned expressions of the generals. Petrov caught a glimpse of himself on the screen, flanked by his peers, eyes wide with disbelief. It was a surreal experience, witnessing both the destruction of his forces and the unflinching attention of the global audience. Humiliation mixed with understanding, pride wrestled with the need to accept an uncomfortable truth: the battlefield had changed, and so must they. Captain Kuznetsov, still young and full of potential, finally spoke. "Sir, we cannot ignore this. If our doctrine does not evolve, the next engagement, the next time, we may not survive." His words were met with solemn nods. The generals, veterans of countless drills, maneuvers, and theoretical scenarios, realized that this single engagement, captured on international broadcast, would be studied for decades, not as a minor skirmish but as a turning point in military history. The ridge grew colder, wind slicing through their heavy coats. Petrov folded his arms, taking a long, steadying breath. He knew the lessons of the day would haunt him, but also guide him. Strategy, training, and courage were pillars of warfare, but they must now be married with speed, precision, and technological foresight. The T-72s had fallen, but their defeat had sparked a reckoning that could ensure future survival, if the generals dared to learn. As the first stars appeared over the horizon, the battlefield lay silent, scarred, and smoldering, a testament to a clash of eras, of technology and tradition, of pride and humility. The generals, still on the ridge, understood the unspoken truth: the world of armored warfare had irrevocably changed, and those who refused to adapt would be left behind. Dawn broke over the battlefield the next morning, pale sunlight filtering through lingering smoke. The remnants of the T-72 battalion lay silent, blackened husks reflecting a war that had already moved beyond steel and fire. The Soviet generals stood together one last time on the ridge, faces drawn, minds heavy with the weight of yesterday's lesson. General Petrov finally spoke, his voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "We have witnessed the future," he said. "It is faster, sharper, and unforgiving. Our tanks were powerful, yes, but today we learned they are not invincible. We cannot fight yesterday's wars with yesterday's tools." The younger officers absorbed the words like a solemn mantra, the truth undeniable: adaptation was no longer optional. Colonel Mikhailov added, "The world will remember this footage, the CNN broadcast, and our faces of disbelief. Let it remind us that knowledge alone does not win battles, execution, precision, and technology do. And if we do not evolve, we are finished before we even fire a shot." The ridge fell silent again, but this time it was contemplative, not stunned. The general surveyed the shattered tanks below, each wreck a lesson carved in steel. The sun glinted off the scorched armor, a harsh reminder of the brutal efficiency of modern warfare. What had been a crushing defeat also became a spark of clarity: to survive, the doctrines of armored warfare must change. As they descended the ridge, the generals carried more than sorrow, they carried understanding. The T-72s had fallen, but the principles learned from their destruction would guide future strategy. Humiliation had transformed into insight, shock into resolve. The battlefield, scarred and silent, had delivered its final verdict: the age of brute armored power had ended, and the age of precision, speed, and innovation had dawned. History would record the event not merely as a loss, but as a turning point, a lesson to armies worldwide. The images of stunned Soviet generals, broadcast globally on CNN, would become a symbol of how quickly the tides of war could shift, and how unpreparedness, even among the most seasoned commanders, could have catastrophic consequences. The ridge, once a vantage point of pride and expectation, now overlooked both defeat and opportunity. And in that quiet, the generals made an unspoken vow: the next era of warfare would see them not just surviving, but adapting, learning, and evolving. The world had changed, and so must they.